Hello everyone. Today's video is about in which order should you treat Lyme and mold if a person has both of those conditions at the same time. As per usual, nothing I'm saying should be construed as medical advice. This is for informational purposes only. If you need medical advice, please talk to your healthcare provider to get that advice. So I posted a video not too long ago that was contrasting the difference between symptoms of chronic Lyme, also known as persistent borreliosis, and mold illness. And kind of the punchline from that video was the lists of symptoms are virtually the same. There are maybe some little differences here and there, but a lot of similarity. So somebody posted a question on that video asking if you have both of these conditions, what do you treat first? So it's a very good question. And like many of the answers that I give, it depends is really the answer. But to delve into that a little bit more, and just not having like a 51-second video of me saying it depends and we're all done. So the things that it depends upon are a couple of things. One would be if a patient seems to have a lot of, so generally, in my experience, it's usually going to be getting the mold treatment protocol going first and then going after infections, but that's not always the case. But some of the factors that help me to decide whether I'm going to recommend that we start going after the mold first or the Lyme first would include how well does the patient's detoxification pathway seem to be working. So if the patient's really sensitive to chemicals, really sensitive to artificial scents, which are from chemicals, things like that. If they have a history of a lot of constipation, a lot of skin issues that would suggest maybe their detoxification pathways aren't working as well, we're probably going to want to get the ball rolling with some detoxification support, which is very much in line with the mold treatment part of the protocol, because when it comes to treating mold, we want to generally fumigate the sinuses if we suspect that there's some sinus colonization of mold. But prior to that, we generally want to make sure that the detox pathways are working well, making sure that the liver has the cofactors it needs for its phase 1, phase 2, and phase 2.5 detox pathways. Want to make sure there's enough antioxidants like glutathione, which are really important for phase 2 detox pathways. And we want to make sure that the excretory organs are working well. So, patients urinating regularly, drinking enough water to make sure they're flushing things out through their kidneys regularly, and that they're having regular bowel movements as well. And ideally, if the patient can be sweating on a semi-regular basis, that's oftentimes helpful or an asset. That's not always possible depending on what's going on with their physiology. So so by getting those processes upregulated, that's a very significant portion of a mold treatment protocol. Of course, we need to. If I guess we're really going to be nitpicky, it's like, well, if the patient's in a really moldy environment, then that environment, first step, really for many people, it should be remediate the environment or move out of that environment. If possible, but assuming that the environment side of things has been taken care of, or that factor is not an ongoing variable. Some people had their mold exposure years ago, moved out of that environment, and brought this sinus colonization of mold with them. But notwithstanding the environmental factors, if there seem to be detoxification compromise issues, then getting that ball rolling first is usually a good idea. And quite frankly, even if a person didn't have a mold illness component and it was quote unquote just Lyme or just Lyme and co-infections, then we want to make sure that they're detoxing well. Otherwise, there could be a lot more Herx reactions, die-off reactions, whatever you want to call them. So that would be one variable to consider in terms of are we going to start going after mold first? Are we going to start going after infections first? Another variable to consider would be, what do the test results look like? So if the patient has a history of mold exposure and they've done a urine mycotoxin test and the levels are off the charts high, and maybe they've also had a test done to look at, say, like an Ellie spot test or something like that, to look for evidence of Lyme, and that also comes back, but those results are more low grade or moderate grade, then that would be another scenario where maybe we'd start with the mold treatment first, get that going, and then piggyback the Lyme treatment on top of that, or maybe vice versa. Maybe the patient had a history of mold exposure and maybe they quote unquote only developed some sinus issues from that, and maybe a little bit of brain fog, maybe a little bit of fatigue, but felt pretty good otherwise, and then they had a fateful tick bite or some other bug bite or some event occurred where it seemed that they contracted Lyme at that point, and then their health just really went to heck in a handbasket. Well, then in that case, it would, again, not in every case, but in that case, it would be more likely that I would recommend that we'd start treating the Lyme first, because that seems to be the bigger factor that's affecting their health, or maybe the patient's just feeling crummy, the low energy, neurological symptoms, things like that, but their history doesn't really point in one direction or another. It was kind of questionable whether there was definite mold exposure before, no obvious tick bite or infectious event. They kind of just gradually felt worse over time, but they did have, they say lived in an older home for a while, or they worked in an older building, or they weren't really sure about exposure. So we say, well, let's just do some testing and see. And we see, say, sort of a high result for their infection results, and low to moderate mycotoxin result, but we don't really have anything in the history to compel us one way or the other. I might tend to gravitate more towards treating the infection before going after mold in a scenario like that. Other things to consider, though, would be, does the person seem to have a lot of mast cell activation going on? Are there a lot of high histamine symptoms going on? If that's the case, then that would generally bias me more towards trying to get the mold under control first, because in my experience, and from what I understand from listening to lots of other smart doctors, whether they're guests on my podcast, or they're at lectures, or like conference lectures or whatnot, it seems that mold is really hands down in many cases the biggest driver of mast cell activation. So that would be a big motivator to try to get on top of the mold first if there's a lot of MCAS symptoms going on. The other factor to consider, and maybe the last factor that I'll mention, so I don't beleaguer the point here, but the another factor to consider is how well the patient's tolerating the treatment in question. So let's say all the signs are pointing towards, or a lot of signs are pointing towards, we should probably treat mold first. Well, we start the protocol, maybe they get on the detox support nicely and easily, but then they just can't seem to tolerate the nasal spray. Well, maybe we try, build it up slowly in the first place. They're flaring from that. Okay, let's build it up even slower. Still flaring from that. Let's try a different nasal spray. Flaring from that. Maybe in that case, the writing on the wall is, let's just keep that mold detox support in there. Let's now phase in the Lyme treatment or the co-infection treatment. And so by doing that, hopefully they'll be feeling better by getting on top of those infections, but also by treating those infections, they should start to feel, by feeling better, that means there's likely going to be a lot less inflammation in their body. They're going to be less reactive to things. Their mast cells are going to be less labile or fragile, and then they can actually start tolerating that mold treatment protocol. They can actually start, or rather, tolerating the nasal spray component of the mold treatment protocol. So that would be another scenario, another factor that would dictate, what are we going to go after first. The very last thing I'll mention is that I just don't want to be leaving anyone with the impression that we have to treat the mold first, and then once the mold's all gone, then we can go after the Lyme. We piggyback treatments all the time, or superimpose treatments, I should say, our protocols all the time. So in these types of cases, generally I'd either phase in the Lyme treatment or the mold treatment first, and then once that's in place, patient seems to be tolerating it well, maybe after 2-3 weeks of that, then we start phasing in the other protocols. So we're treating both simultaneously. So which one do we start with? Those are some of what I've mentioned here are some of the factors to consider with figuring out where to start, but then we're likely going to be treating both things at the same time if we're able to. And of course, if the patient is up for doing that, it's always up to the patient what they are going to do. But most folks are like, just get this stuff out of me, let's kill off the bugs, let's get these mycotoxins out of here. So usually they're pretty much on board to treat both things simultaneously, as long as they're tolerating things well. It's really important not to overdo it with treatment, because then folks can just feel markedly worse, and it really, in my opinion, in my experience, makes the whole healing process a heck of a lot less efficient in the grand scheme of things. So better to move at a pace that patients are tolerating well. So thank you for the question. I hope that this answered your question. If anybody has any questions or comments on this topic, please feel free to post in the comment section below, and otherwise I will leave it there for now.